Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. I'm your host, Marty Bennett, and today on the Roundup for Wednesday, March 26th, 2025, we're going to be answering three questions we've been hearing from international educators over the last 7 days. And what a 7 days it's been. It doesn't seem like a day goes by without some kind of news impacting our field in this new Trump 2.0 environment. And we'll be discussing some of those topics today in answering our questions, which we'll get to in just a minute. And as we do each week on the Roundup, we take our questions that we cover from our news stories that come out and that we catalog our hot takes on in our newsletter called All the SMIE News Fit to Share, which comes out on Monday mornings at 9 a.m. Eastern if you subscribe to the email version of that. And I'll drop the link to this week's edition in the chat, and you can get the subscription to the email version on our website, smieconsulting.org/subscribe. Enter your details and you'll get that delivered to your inbox every Monday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern. If you prefer to get your news through LinkedIn, which many of us do, there is a LinkedIn version of it as well, and I'll drop the link to this week's edition in the chat as we go along. And for those who aren't familiar, the newsletter, between the two versions, the email newsletter and the LinkedIn version, we now have over 2,400 subscribers. We're so honored that we're coming to so many of you each week to your inboxes or LinkedIn feeds to share our quick takes on what's happening in our field. And there's been a lot of news lately, since particularly January 20th, as to what is happening. And each week we endeavor to share those quick stories with you that cover topics anywhere from social media and international ed news that reflect anything from AI developments, use of social media in our field, upcoming webinars, new online reports, blogs, all those kind of things that are in the digital world that you need to be aware of. We also have stories on kind of the actual news of the day in terms of new legislation or new executive orders, which we know there's been a lot of recently. So we cover those in depth. We also do a Solutions Central section, which focuses on some positive ways that we can be adjusting what we do in international ed to meet the changing dynamics of our field. And that is an important step we want to take each day, each week, and be positive in our content that we provide. And then we also have a global roundup of what's happening in other countries, major destination markets, and some of the things that they're doing to improve their international education strategies and comments and all of that that impacts what we do in other countries. And that kind of perspective is something we talk about regularly here on the Roundup, because knowing what your competition is doing, what their struggles are, what their benefits, what they're seeing as some of their advantages are, things that they're doing different that we could potentially be doing here, learning how to adapt to that, learning how to answer that from a U.S. perspective as we talk to prospective students, all of that is important knowledge to have. I know as an international educator, I work full-time for a university in Ohio, University of Akron, as Director of International Recruitment and Engagement. I know how busy we get in our work. I've been in the field for 32 years, and it's hard enough sometimes to look up from the day-to-day tasks that take up so much of our time to really get a sense of what's going on in the wider world, let alone on our campuses and in our nation. So we take the time each week to summarize through the newsletter those kind of hot takes on those news stories. It's usually a 5 to 10 minute read to catch all those details, and then you can go back and check out the news stories with the links to the original story for more detail. And then we pick 3 of those themes that we see developing in the news stories each week to cover here on the Wednesday roundups. And the roundups are meant to be more thinking a little bit more deeply about the issues of the day and how we might be able to respond better to them as international educators on our institutional campuses here in the U.S. But we do recognize that we have a global audience that watches these roundups mostly on repeat, either on our YouTube channel, our LinkedIn page, or on Facebook for SMIE Consulting. So we appreciate those that take the time to watch on repeat, and we know most folks aren't able to watch live. So appreciate that. And we do also have an audio-only podcast version of the roundup that you can find on all major podcast providers. So just look up Midweek Roundup and SMIE Consulting, and you'll find that and be able to subscribe. So our first question of the day is, are U.S. institutions and the U.S. in general, U.S. higher ed, U.S. media, overreacting to Trump? And this is something that it's a tough topic for our field to talk about, because so many in our profession tend to be more liberal than perhaps the U.S. electorate has been in this last election, and certainly don't agree with most all of what the Trump administration is doing. That's the general consensus of most international educators. We are reacting and fearful in a lot of ways for what's coming next. We went through Trump 1.0 from 2017 to 2021 when he had his first term in office. And we know that there were a lot of things that happened in that 4 years that were, if they had been fully implemented, would have become existential threats to who we are and what we do in our field. Fortunately, reason prevailed in that first administration with through the courts, fortunately, with the overturning of a lot of the moves that the administration was trying to make to limit OPT. It wasn't administration driven, it was a lawsuit driven, but overturned travel bans, put in the exemptions for students into those travel bans. We're about to get travel ban 2.0 or 3.0, depending on your perspective on that. So we'll see how that shakes out, and that's causing a lot of us to have, really, I've been calling it PTSD from from his first administration 8 years ago, now going through a lot of those same feelings again, and any executive orders. And it's even, frankly, the pace at which this administration has moved to act unilaterally through the executive orders that have been put in place, which almost all of which are being challenged in the courts. And the courts are the only hope to really to defeat a lot of the negativeness of the current administration's view toward anything international and even education in general. The move to eliminate or redistribute the duties of the Department of Education. That's one thing we do always need to keep perspective on things, is what is happening with that. It's redistributing roles and duties of the Department of Education when it comes to student loans and Pell Grants and all that, through now the SBA, Small Business Administration, to the Health and Human Services Department will be taking on any of those services for disabled students and other in-kind services that need to be provided on the state and local levels, and how the money gets redistributed. That's a question that Congress, that typically that money that has gone to the states for implementation of programs, that is still TBA, and who does that, how that functions. The bottom line, though, is the Department of Education as a whole isn't going to be disbanded. People have been laid off. Yep, and there are going to be challenges in court to a lot of this. The Department of Education obviously impacts and has direct relations with a lot of higher ed associations that our industry depends on. ACE is being perhaps the most obvious one of those, but organizations like NACAC, NAFSFA, that deals with foreign financial aid, all of these organizations have very strong ties to the Department of Education, so they obviously have very clear threats to that. International education within the Department of Education has always been a fairly niche piece and not a real strong part of what the Department of Education has done on the post-secondary level, other than the financial aid piece, which impacts a student's ability to go abroad, all those things, which aren't necessarily under threat, but are certainly going to be relocated in terms of who handles that and who distributes those funds in this if this current model moves forward. The piece that is of particular concern is the foreign Fulbright or the Fulbright Department of the Department of Education that funds U.S. folks going abroad for teacher education. All these kind of things are part of what the Department of Education done. That department was eliminated as part of the restructuring and staff laid off, all of that. So it remains to be seen what will happen moving forward with lawsuits and all those things, as with most all of the Trump agenda and the executive orders, the challenges to those. And but as a piece of legal reality check, what we saw with Trump signing the executive order to disband the Department of Education is political theater and nothing more, because he alone cannot do that. The Congress is the only body, since it created the Department of Education, it's in the 70s, is the only one that can disband it. And it requires a 60 vote in favor of disbanding in the U.S. Senate, and that's not happening in the current scenario where the Republicans only have 51, 52 votes, and they're not going to get eight Democrats to come on board and to support that. So that was political theater, pure and simple. But sometimes we lose that sight of what actually is happening. What I want to bring today is what I always try and do is a dose of perspective on what is actually happening and how we can and should be responding to a lot of what is going on, which we perceive as real threats to what we do. I work very, very much in the international student recruitment sphere and developing strategies and policies to bring students to our campus for study. There are things that are being done that and have done even before this administration came in, that last year we saw the highest ever visa denial rate. And people are going to try and lay that on the Trump administration, but it might get a little bit worse, but it's not going to get we can only hope it gets better, but it was at an all-time high. 41% of visa applicants were denied last year. And that's during the Biden administration. Over the last 4 years, they built up that track record. What is a little known fact, before COVID, in the first 3 years of the Trump administration, 17, 18, and 19, there was actually an increase in international students in the United States studying here. That gets lost in the mix because we think, well, all these travel bans and all these threats to what he's doing. And now we're seeing study portals put out a survey this week that there's been a 42% drop in student searches for the United States, study in the United States. So that's a worry in terms of projecting future actualities. And study portals based in Europe has a strong base in Europe that is primarily graduate focused. Europe has always been the place where the Trump administration is viewed least favorably. We saw last week in the IDP survey that it was only 1,000 students, but was a worldwide sample. There was over half were favorable. 52% viewed the U.S. more favorably because of Trump's election. So there's conflicting data out there, and that's not surprising. Where the lion's share of respondents to a particular survey, the way the questions were asked, do pose some difficulties in terms of interpreting them and making assumptions across all students in every major market. There will be markets that respond positively to Trump, and that's maybe hard to imagine from our lens here in the U.S., but we see India and the U.S. having perhaps a closer relationship. Modi and Trump have always gotten along. They had a summit recently that said, hey, we want more U.S. institutions to set up shop in India. We want more bilateral ties. We want more students to be able to go. Maybe that kickstarts a rejuvenation of the Indian market, which had fallen off. 40% fewer Indians got U.S. student visas last fall. We all saw that across the campus, across the country, and that's pre-Trump. So we're dealing with a lot of things right now, but one of the things I want to share is first NAFSA had a LinkedIn live event this past week that they hosted, and there was also Also, in that, which was attended by Fanta Ah, the president of NAFSA, Jill Ann Murray from NAFSA, Jill Welch from the U.S. for Success Coalition, David Fosnacht from NAFSA. He's their guy one of their guys on the Hill that looks at congressional policy and how it's implemented and gets the feel. And then Mark Overman, a legend in the advocacy business for the Academy for the for the Alliance for International Exchange. They all presented on this live event on LinkedIn, and the overwhelming theme there was breathe and take a step back and let's focus on being positive. And that seems like hard to do, and it was a needed session. I think there were comments from folks who were venting, but also seeking advice, seeking solutions. That Fanta, who I've known for many years, over 2 decades now, she said it's time to act, it's time to do your part, and it's time to not panic. And that was, I think, the overarching theme. Mark Overman reflected that as well. He gave some good news, heartwarming news. I guess we're looking for anything we can get right now because this is coming the week after we heard about all the funding issues for grantees of Fulbright, Gilman, Humphrey, all these U.S. State Department grants that have been on pause for funding, also impacting the domestic Education USA staff in Washington, D.C., folks who are near and dear to my heart, only 2 of which are left working. The rest have been furloughed. There was a reaction to that, and that came up in the chat. And Mark shared that funding is slowly starting to be renewed. I saw something from him this morning that said they're up to 85% of funding has been restored on funding is past due to the organizations that are the implementing organizations for a lot of these programs, Fulbright, Gilman, whatever it might be, Education USA. So that's good news. It's coming back to where it really should never have been moved from, but that's progress. Again, it was never a permanent cut. It was a review period, and the process of renewing that after the review period has been slower than we would like when we obsess very clearly on any move that the government makes seems to be a threat to us. It should never happen, but it is happening. We're in a very different climate where everything is up for review. Literally everything in the government is up for review with what Doge is doing with Elon Musk's group. And there is a need for just taking the appropriate action, as Fanta said, and as international educators, we'll talk about in the second question what that looks like. But the overall theme of this first question is, are we overreacting in higher ed to what's going on in the press, to what's going on? We look at the Inside Higher Ed article that just dropped the link to. It states Trump's latest target, foreign scholars, where we've had ICE raids, and which aren't just on U.S. campuses. They're getting the worst of the worst out of the country that are in the country illegally, but it's also spilled over to campuses where. As we saw with Mahmoud Khalil, a graduate of Columbia, not a current student there anymore, not an international student. He is a green card holder, but he was deemed a threat to national security and is in deportation proceedings, and there are legal challenges that are underway now to that. But what this Inside Higher Ed story does, it talks about Khalil, and then it talks about 3 faculty members. One at Georgetown that was detained outside his home for alleged pro-Palestinian activity that has yet to be specified, and a Lebanese professor at Brown who at their medical school was denied re-entry after attending the funeral of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah. And I'm sorry, dude, what are you thinking? Attending a funeral of the leader of Hezbollah? I can see why you were denied entry to the country if that's what you were doing. So in this climate, that probably wasn't the smartest move this professor made. Another was a French scientist who, according to the statement from the French Minister of Higher Education and Research, was denied entry into the U.S. because of his personal opinion on the Trump administration's research policy. That's what the French said about him. We haven't heard anything about why the government decided to not allow him entry. So these are 3 cases of faculty, and that are now being. And then the Mahmoud Khalil, another Indian student, left the country, felt she had to leave the country as a result. But that's about it. There are over 1.1 million international students in the United States at over 6,800 schools, colleges, universities, vocational schools. 1, 2, 3 students maybe we've heard stories of, and believe me, we're hearing all of them when they come out. That's all, and we're obsessing about this and thinking it's the end of our profession. Perspective. So we all get upset because we're on campuses, we're feeling the pressure, we're getting the constant questions from our current students about what to expect, what to do next. And we talked last week about being on a blue campus in a blue state that's got a target on its back because of the institution's profile. A lot of the Ivies and the more selective schools are certainly on the radar because they are the ones that typically had the worst of the anti-Israel protests and the violence that was at some of these very few, and the rhetoric, that's pro-Hamas rhetoric, that's getting a lot of the attention. That's if you're on those campuses, yes, students, if they were involved, have a little bit more to be worried about than the average student that has never set a foot wrong during their time in the United States. But that should always be the case. They shouldn't be setting foots wrong, and be cautious about what they get involved in. And you can talk about free speech, and there are certainly good cases to be made here, but we're not talking about that here. We're talking about something very different. In an age where the government is trying to counterbalance the previous administration that kind of seemed to let a lot of things go, whether it be the southern border being wide open to flood the country with 8 million people over the last 4 years that did not have papers, that were let loose into the country, a very small fraction of which were criminals and have very bad intentions in coming into the U.S. That are in the process of being rounded up and deported, to what's happening on our campuses, which is obviously a very different environment. So the stories that I'm sharing with you are also Bunker Hill Community College in Massachusetts has canceled study abroad programs this summer because of fear that those students will not be let back in. Depends on where they're from, and that was a decision that, in my opinion, is an overreaction. Certainly, there are pending travel bans that are going to impact up to 43 countries. Only the red countries are going to be fully outright bans, and that list of countries is still to be determined, and nothing's out publicly yet on that, other than what the New York Times reported last week. But what this community college has done, you see Ivy League schools now telling current students, like they did before Trump was elected, they said, hey, if he's elected, and you're a current student, get back in the country before Inauguration Day. Wow, that was a little bit overreach, wasn't it? That was an overreaction. Is it in an abundance of caution? No, it's overreaction. It's politicizing an issue that didn't need to be politicized. Yale Law School and Brown have issued warnings to international students now to reconsider travel plans for the summer. So it's basically striking fear into the hearts of our international students that are here. These articles, the actions of our campuses that are, in my opinion, overreacting, that they're creating, in another article's view, a palpable fear hangs over international students. Another Inside Higher Ed article that I'll be sharing the link to. So what can we do to really speak some sense into ourselves, into our leadership on campus, and into our elected officials about what's happening? that comes only through advocacy and conversations we have on our campuses with our leadership, senior leadership, because part of our responsibility is not just taking care of our current students, informing our prospective students on what the reality is that they're going to be facing when they go for a visa appointment, when they come in the country for at the border. That's our role for our current students. We need to be managing up, and managing up involves having having the facts on what the current state of affairs is, working with your government affairs offices on campus, your senior leadership on campus, so that they're aware that these are very real concerns that do exist, and painting them in a way that doesn't paint you as someone who's overreacting, as someone who's just got their hair on fire because of everything that Trump is doing. The reality, and this is why I appreciate the NAFSA webinar the other day, is that it forces you to step back and get some perspective and think, okay, what's actually been said, what is still legally possible, and what impact potential changes can have to what we do, and why we need to be advocating for our students and for our campuses, frankly, because in a lot of cases, our campuses and our international offices, it's self-interest. Yes, we need to be defending who we are as institutions, who we are for our students. We are their support, like we did 8 years ago with You Are Welcome Here. We rallied together as campuses to show our support for our international students, to make them feel welcome. We need to do that again. We need something public to be done to show our students that we are there. And the more we do that and are showing them that we're defending them without overreacting, defending them, being rational, being reasonable, some things that you typically aren't associating with the actions of the current administration. So that's the question too we're getting into. How can we advocate as a profession? The comments coming out of the NAFSA webinar about advocating for your students, giving the ways that can be done. I was really heartened to hear that the Alliance had, when the news about the new travel bans was coming out, came out, had an action day on the Hill when that happened, so they were able to jump and leverage the people that they already had participating to go do some good on the Hill with their elected representatives about the funding, particularly that was coming down. The funding restrictions have been put in place and was having real life effects on people in the United States that were awardees from overseas, and our folks going overseas to study as Fulbrighters, Gilmans, Humphreys scholars, all of that. So that that advocacy effort by the Alliance had a very positive effect. NAFSA has their advocacy day coming up in early April. They're hoping for a similar response. And both the organizations said that they've had record responses to their request for advocacy and they make it so simple to do. It's and how we can advocate for our profession. They make it so easy. NAFSA especially, they have with the emails they send out, you get a link. It's linked to your individual account as a member. When you click on that link, it takes you to a pre-form filled out letter that will then go to all three of your congressional representatives, your two senators and your local state congressional rep for the House. It has these formatted right then and there. And then those you click a link and you can make some adjustments if you want, and those letters go immediately to your elected representatives. I got one back from one of my senators right away. My House representative also responded, thanking me for contributing to making my voice heard to them. And whether it moves the needle or not, I can't say for sure, but I took proactive steps to do something about this. And getting on social media and venting, we all need to vent. I totally get that. I've had my share of venting, but I have my trusted colleagues who I can do that with in private. I generally don't want to make that public as much as possible. I talk about it here as I do each week, in trying to develop practical steps we can take to deal with the issues of the day. That's the theme of the Roundup every week, is being practical in terms of what we can do and address the topics of the day that are really the ones that are are taking up our time, and frankly, and a lot of our days are filled with putting out fires on campus. I know our executive director of our international center, she has a twice a week digest she sends out to all of our international students, and just has practical tips each day, each time that comes out, that they can use to help them get through and make informed decisions as to what to do next. But the advocacy efforts are so clear, and I'm putting the links to what I get from NAFSA for as a member in the chat. So if you are a NAFSA member, you'll get something similar if you've gotten the emails from Erica Stewart and others at NAFSA to get this out to them. So take the time to do these simple ways to get your message in front of your elected officials. Help share this content, the copy and paste these letters. And here's what I've been sending to our elected officials from our representative international aid organization, NAFSA. Here's just the messaging that we're saying. We'd like everybody to be on the same page. Do you have any issues with this? Can we share this up the chain at the university and through our governmental affairs effort? So these are things that we need to be doing more of. And especially now more than ever, where it seems that we're under threat, that our profession is under threat. Higher education and as a whole is under threat in the United States from every news story we see. But let's take a step back, breathe, and think about what can we be doing to take proactive steps to help defend our students and defend our profession. So that's what we can be doing. Now let's quickly move on to our final issue of the day. I know we're already at 31 minutes, but I want to make sure I cover this one. Our friends north of the border are having a rough time. They're coming off 2 years of just dismal performance in terms of new international students. They're in the second year of these mandatory reductions in study permits that'll be issued by the Canadian government. What the reality of it has been is that those study permits have dropped far more than the 30% they had initially intended. We've seen drops of 40, 45% in some cases. In some markets, the collapse has been absolutely catastrophic, with Indian market, the Indian market in particular, falling apart in Canada. And that's a combination of a lot of different factors. But what Canada has put so many of their international education eggs in the India basket that not enough of them, outside of the few elite schools in British Columbia and Ontario and Quebec, were able to pivot quickly or ride the wave and manage the declines that they were experiencing. The private colleges and many of the public colleges that are vocational in Canada have suffered tremendous damage, but even some of the universities are laying off staff. In Vancouver, there's a couple of stories that are covered on Kwantlen Polytechnic University in Vancouver that has laid off a number of faculty already, closing some departments. And some of those closures of academic departments is happening, especially at the college level, vocational level, in Ontario province especially. So there are some very real threats, certainly much worse than, if you can imagine that, much worse than what we're experiencing here in the United States. And that's, again, that perspective we need to be having. In fact, all four major destination markets, US, Canada, Australia, and UK, have been suffering drops. Real drops in their numbers over the last year to 2 years. And the UK seems to be the one that's coming out best. Other European destinations are also seem to be able to capitalize on some of the downturns that are happening in these other markets. But our friends up north are really suffering right now, so do spare thought for them. That's all we have for you this week on the Midweek Roundup. Thank you for being a part of the conversation, and looking forward to chatting with you in the days and weeks to come. Cheers.